At the height of the Second World War, the Japanese decided to carve a railway through the mountainous jungles of Thailand and Burma. Like the pyramids of Egypt, the railway would be a testament to imperial might, built with little else than the muscle power of 250,000 men. Dutch, Australian, British and American prisoners of war were to be forced into slavery. More than 1 in 5 of them would be worked to death. But there were far more victims of the railway, whose deaths were to be completely unrecorded. The Allies couldn't prevent a human tragedy. But in the last year of the war, the Americans unleashed a secret weapon on the railway, their first smart bomb. It was to prove a spectacular success. Yet the story of the daring bombing raids has remained largely unrecognized. The most famous bridge on the railway, the bridge on the River Kwai, survives today. Its place in history secured by a Hollywood movie. But other remnants have faded away into the jungle. For all its fame, the bridge on the Kwai is little more than a gateway to a lost railway. This is the story of its rediscovery. When the Imperial Japanese Army overran the Malay Peninsula and Burma in 1942, it humiliated the old European colonial powers. But Japan's advance had been so rapid that its front line in Burma was now dangerously stretched and vulnerable to counterattack. Resupply by sea was too slow and exposed to Allied submarines. Japan's only hope was to cut a railway through the virgin jungles of Thailand and Burma. It would be the most audacious engineering feat in World War II. But how would they do it? Engineer Bashar Altabba has come to Thailand to see for himself how the railway was built and at what cost. Educated in England, he's used to solving complex engineering puzzles with the latest in computer modeling techniques. But he's fascinated by a railway built on such a vast scale, with only the most primitive of tools, in less than 16 months.
This was hardcore engineering. There is no question it was first rate. It's that element of it is incredible. How could they have achieved it in the limited amount of time and the resources that they had?
Bashar is traveling up the remaining miles of track to meet a man who'll be his guide, Rod Beatty.
This is some cut, Rod.
A huge overhang here.
Must have taken huge effort to do this.
There were a few men buried here in rockfall, not large numbers. One of the funny little anecdotes here is that
as manager of war graves in Thailand and director of a railway museum, Rod Beatty has a passion to understand the railway. Over 9 years, he's walked almost its entire length, uncovering secrets that have been hidden for more than half a century.
We have this engineering achievement, and probably one of the greatest engineering achievements of the Second World War, to get this railway built through such terrible terrain in such a short period of time, to have it operate until the end of the war when the Japanese surrendered. So you have that balanced by the loss of almost 100,000 lives. Yeah, the tragedy of the railway.
Wow, this is awesome.
This is Wang Po, this is it. The one surviving trestle on the railway.
Whampoa Viaduct on the bank of the River Kwai is a working monument to wartime ingenuity and ruthlessness. The Japanese sacrificed the lives of prisoners and even their own men to build these trestles around a 200-foot-high escarpment. But Whampoa is the only example that's left on the railway of how the Japanese designed and built wooden bridges, and it's been heavily rebuilt since the war. So how were the original bridges really constructed? Part of the answer lies with this man. In 1942, Renichi Sugano was a young Japanese army major who'd been retrained as a railway engineer. He was ordered to Thailand to supervise track construction in some of the most difficult jungle terrain. As the railway was being built, he secretly took hundreds of photographs, a secret he's kept until now. Sugano's pictures give a unique insight into how the Japanese designed and engineered a railway that he himself took great pride in.
Well, when the work was done and we saw our locomotive run on the railway, I was so pleased. That was a joy that only engineers can understand.
In a small jungle clearing, Rod Beatty has laid on a surprise for the two engineers. He's built an exact quarter-scale model of the bridges seen in Renichi Sugano's photographs.
Ah. Nice job.
There it is.
Very nice job.
But Bashar has brought with him a surprise of his own. Photographs he's found of 19th century American railroad bridges bear a striking resemblance to Rod's model bridge.
This one. Very similar. Yeah. Very similar. It's much bigger. And it goes on and on.
But these similarities may be more than just a coincidence. Bashar believes he's found the source of Japanese bridge designs.
And I came up with this manual called the Merriman manual. I'm wondering whether it's the same manual that you guys were using, because if you look inside, you know, look. It's exactly the same. Same.
You're right. Our designs look like they're based on this manual. They look exactly the same.
But American bridges were designed for much heavier locomotives than those on the Thai-Burma railway. By copying American designs, the Japanese would build their bridges stronger than they needed to be. Another burden for the railway's slave laborers, whose lives were to become a hell beyond imagining. The Allied prisoners of war destined for the labor camps of the Thai-Burma Railway had no idea of what lay ahead of them.
We were addressed by a Japanese officer and told that we were going to go to a rest area, that we would do nothing for the duration of the war except relax and have good food.
Japanese propaganda films went even further. Prisoners of war were going to a land of milk and honey. The truth did not take long to sink in.
We went up Malaya on the existing railway in steel boxcars. We travelled 3 days in those boxcars, and of course During the day it's like an oven, and night time it's very cold as we got further north.
And we finished up at Ban Pong. It was a hell of a stench, was unbearable. The roofs were leaking, there was mud on the floor, toilets weren't built yet, we had to dig around. And that's how we started to build the railway.
I think we're about a week in Ban Pong. Some of our old comrades had gone up earlier, and it came as a shock to us when we saw the state they were in. They'd all got malaria and dysentery, and so you can imagine how we felt, what the hell's in store for us, you know. If he's gone, what chance have I got?
From Ban Pong, the prisoners would be force-marched to camps all along the route of the railway. The Japanese High Command had decreed that to finish the railway quickly, all 260 miles of it would be built simultaneously. Wherever possible, the Japanese planned the railway along the course of the River Kwai. But at one point, 90 miles upriver, the terrain defeated them. A sheer 400-foot cliff at Tampi gave them no choice. No bridge or viaduct could be built around this, so the railway would have to climb over it. Instead of an easier route on the river valley floor, the railway would need to be built on a long, slow gradient to a point where it could cut through the mountain. This point became known as Hellfire Pass. It's one of the most notorious places on the entire length of the railway.
Well, there's a drill hole there on the face, another drill hole in the face.
Look at this. God.
It's one of the longest and deepest cuttings anywhere on the railway. It took 3 months for Australian and British prisoners to cut through an outcrop of solid rock. Hundreds died during construction. For Bashar, the engineering puzzle is wire cutting and not a tunnel.
So, Mr. Sugano, why didn't you tunnel instead of doing this cut?
A tunnel can only be cut from each end of the hill, and that would take too long. But this was wartime, so we chose to cut through the hill, using all the men, all at the same time.
Because a tunnel would only have 2 small entrances, it would restrict the number of prisoners who could work on it. So the Japanese decided to dig down through solid rock for the entire length of Hellfire Pass, employing hundreds of prisoners and completing the work more quickly. The Japanese could afford to make such a cold calculation. There was a huge supply of slave labor. But here, and everywhere else on the line, the prisoners were increasingly sick and malnourished. The consequences were terrible.
The Japanese would say, "Oh no, he's not sick enough, he has to go to work." The Japanese, they would make you work. Literally, they would make you work until you really passed out and fell to the ground.
The sick weren't even excused from the exhausting work of stone breaking.
When you got all the big stones off and you got roughly a ledge, then you had to get the smaller stones and smash them up into small pieces as a base for the railway. And that was wasting too much time of us that was shifting all the other rocks. So they made us bring the sick out of the camp. We had to carry him out there, sit him in the bloody sun, you know, give him a little hammer, and he was breaking stones all day. And the Jap would be watching them, make sure they did the share. And quite often you'd end up carrying them back dead.
Deep in the jungles of Thailand and Burma, and cut off completely from the outside world, the prisoners had no idea how the Second World War was unfolding. In fact, even as the prisoners started work on the railway, the war was turning against Japan. In June 1942, the Japanese launched an air and sea attack on the tiny Pacific atoll of Midway, expecting, like Pearl Harbor, to take the Americans by surprise. This time, though, the United States Navy was waiting for them. In a fierce battle that raged for 3 days, the Japanese lost 4 of the aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. With their victory at Midway, the United States and her allies were gaining air and sea superiority. Resupplying Japanese troops in Burma was now even more dependent on the completion of the railway. In January 1943, the Japanese issued a new order. It came to be known as Speedo.
Our officers called us together and said, the Japanese have said that they have a deadline on which to finish this railroad, and that we're going to have to work harder, that we're going to go to work earlier, and that we're going to work later. And they used this word, speedo, speedo. They began to use that word every day. That word speedo, you went to bed with it ringing in your ears at night, you know?
This was to be the most deadly period during the railway's construction. Death rates among already exhausted and sick prisoners climbed dramatically as the Japanese Speedo orders were brutally enforced.
Oh, it was terrible. It were the engineers who were the real bastards. They were absolute. I would call them animals, because animals are not even like that. Total. Let's put it this way. Providing you could walk, you stand up, and you could lift up something, you were fit to work. Now, whether you're bleeding out of your ears or whether you were bleeding out of someone else, didn't matter.
Beneath a towering cliff, in a forgotten corner of the Thai jungle, Renichi Sugano relives his own memories on the railway. This was Takanoon railway camp, as photographed by Sugano himself. Under Sugano's close supervision, an entire cliff face had to be cut and blasted away. Even in peacetime, this would be dangerous work, but it was done during Speedo and in the monsoon.
For your recollection, did anybody die on this site? On this?
On this site, there were no accidents. There were no casualties.
No accidents.
Yeah.
Nobody died. Wow. Wow.
Bashar is not convinced.
I work a lot in mining and tunneling myself, and this work is very, very dangerous usually. And the conditions under which it was done and the level of difficulty, it's extraordinary that nobody had actually had an accident, a fatal accident. What was the largest number of people that you ever had at one point in the whole stretch?
Only a small unit was deployed to this site. There are about 45 Japanese soldiers, and as well as those, there are about 50 Malay miners. So there are about 100 workers working at this site. We didn't use any POWs.
But one of Sugano's own photographs hints at a different story. Behind the Japanese soldiers in the foreground are some distinct human shapes. and they appear to be prisoners. Fragments of uniform suggest they might be Australian. So were there prisoners here after all? Sugano himself was never charged with war crimes, and there's no documented case of his abuse of Allied prisoners. But 60 years on, it seems it's still difficult for Japanese veterans of the railway to comprehend what really happened here.
The construction was undertaken in wartime, an unusual time. And because of that, there are many victims. That is a fact. I sincerely regret their deaths. But I think that is the reality of war.
By mid-1943, as the railway was racing towards completion, Allied bombers were also getting closer. With hundreds of vulnerable wooden bridges, the line should have been an easy target. But the Allies had a problem. Dropping bombs from 5,000 feet or more onto narrow targets like railway track had proved spectacularly unsuccessful. They needed something far more accurate. American scientists had an idea. They wanted to make bombs smarter. The race was on to develop a reliable guidance system. Soon, the world's first heat-seeking bombs were being tested. Remote-controlled glider bombs carrying television cameras were dropped onto testing ranges. The pictures beamed back to the aircraft with a first-ever bomb's eye view of an intended target. Unfortunately, the bomb's camera was so big, there was little room for any explosive. But one smart bomb was showing promise.
This is a 1,000-pound bomb dropped from an altitude of 15,000 feet. The bomb is radio-controlled in azimuth. Its name is Azon.
Azon was the first successful smart bomb. But how did it work? Using disturbances in water to simulate wind and turbulence, this test shows how hard it is for dumb bombs to hit a target. At a pool depth of just 15 feet, the results are miss after miss after miss. But add a rudder and a radio control device so that the bombardier can steer it, and the results are very different. And that's exactly what American scientists did. A 600,000 candle power flare was fitted to the bomb's tail, so the bombardier could see it all the way to its target. Frank Nelson was one of a select few bombardiers who were trained to drop Azons. He operated his radio controls for the bombs from the cramped forward section of a B-24 Liberator, exactly like this one.
We were set aside and separate orders were cut and we were sent to Fort Dix Air Force Base. We didn't know until we got the orders just what we were going to do, you know, but of course we were excited about it. It was Azon was the only thing we were taught there, the maintenance of the Azon equipment itself, but also the handling of the bomb and the use of the control system.
After months of training, Frank Nelson got to fly his first Azon.
The first time I dropped an Azon bomb, all of a sudden there goes the flare, and you think, oh boy, here I am, you know. The CO is looking over your shoulder and so forth, and you make a few adjustments. And I got a hit right in the middle of this circle. Bullseye first time, yeah. I can't say that I got a bullseye every time by a long shot.
Azon was ready to be deployed against real targets. The Allies now had a weapon that could destroy a railway.
A little bit careful here.
Railway hunter Rod Beatty is guiding engineer Bashar Altabba toward a part of the railway he's recently rediscovered and the source of an enduring mystery. This is Kinsayok.
But yeah, the railway ballast here is very, very obvious.
Death rates here were among the worst on the railway.
Very, very obvious.
Yet the cause is hard to see.
Limestone again, napped down by prisoners of war.
Unknowingly, Bashar is actually walking on the reason why. Kinsayok is a vast embankment, hidden in the jungle like a lost Inca temple.
Rod, they built a mountain in here.
Well, standing here, it looks like it, doesn't it?
Jesus.
Look at this. Just an unbelievable embankment. And we've been walking on this for hundreds of yards. Do you want to see how difficult it is to sort of walk up and down this thing?
You were intent of me getting a physical sense of how difficult it was, huh?
To experience the ride. That's it.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to do a calculation here while you're sort of working your way carefully down there.
I'll see you in a little bit.
Okay.
Rod has been worried that Bashar is still looking at the railway just as an engineer.
It's quite steep, actually.
Now he's going to see it from the prisoner's perspective.
Now remember, this is bare feet.
Bare feet? They didn't have boots?
Most of them didn't have boots by this time, so it's bare feet. It's pouring rain. There are no trees to hold on to, remember.
An embankment that is about 6 foot high is not too bad. But once it gets high, which happens because, you know, it's very undulating, that is real murder, because you think, well, when you first start this job, you think, well, oh, I can do this, it's all right. But it's from early morning till late at night, up and down, up like a human chain.
Hey, Rod, you are absolutely right. There's clear evidence here of them excavating all the soil between this rock. I'm below the rock level right here.
Now the trick is to pick up about a 20-pound rock while you're down there, Basher, and bring that back to me. That's your basket of wet soil.
I can tell you I'm going to lose my... You know what?
Have you ever climbed a dune? This is exactly the same. You cannot move, and your thigh muscles got stiff. You can see them, and they're very, very, very painful. You cannot move. You think you cannot move, but then a Jap comes along with his huge bamboo sticks, and you get moving all right, just to get rid of this thing on your back.
Stripped of 60 years of undergrowth, Kinsayok embankment would have looked like this. It was built to stretch across a long depression in the land, too long for a wooden bridge.
One more step, one more step.
Yeah, it's easy. Okay, where does this go now?
Just there, right there.
Your back starts killing you after a while, huh? It's not so much the arms or the legs, it's the back, because you're bending forward like this all the time.
Now, remember when you headed down there, I said I'd do some calculations.
Yeah.
So we've got 30 yards wide by 20 yards by 400 yards long. That's 250,000 cubic yards of soil up here.
Yeah.
Yes. The baskets, just like you've carried up, about half a cubic foot.
Okay.
Right, half a cubic foot, so we've got 250,000 cubic
figure out how many-
yards. That's about 6.25 cubic feet.
Yeah.
By 2, so you've only got to do another 12.5 million trips down there and back. But the reality is, it took men that long, months and months and months to do just exactly what you've done.
So you really do not appreciate it until you have to do it.
No. It's impossible to even come close to understand it. And I must apologise, that's why I got you to
No. I mean,
it's
it's funny. It's one thing to read about it or to hear people talk about it, but to find yourself in the middle of it, to feel that you're going to be up and down with no realization of what the future is, I cannot possibly imagine.
The unending hard labour was bad enough, but prisoners also had to endure random acts of sadism from their guards.
They pick somebody, make him stand in front of him, and give him a heavy boulder to put in his arms and hold above his head. A Jap sits behind him on a chair, and on a chair, and he has a bayonet on and he sort of sticks it between his shoulder blade. Nothing serious, just sticks it up, it goes again. And when that happens, they really roll about laughing. The control you have to take it, because you know if you don't, that bayonet goes into your gut, and that's your lot.
I got pinched for stealing fish once, and I got put in a bamboo cell. This was 4 feet by 4 feet square and 5 feet high. The door was only about 2 feet square. Of course, the flies, you had to make sure no flies got in, because the food, you were given this rice and salt and water twice a day. I was in there for 10 days, and I was just thinking to myself, I don't know how I got through it really.
For nearly 60 years, the symbol of the prisoners' suffering has been the bridge on the River Kwai. But the reality was that the bridge was built at a major river port, so food and medical supplies were relatively abundant. The steel bridge and a wooden bridge long since vanished claimed the lives of just 9 prisoners. Elsewhere, the death rate was much worse.
If you wanted to really see a bridge over the River Kwai, you had to go to number 2 camp to see exactly how the Japs really built a bridge.
In April 1943, a group of British and Australian prisoners began a forced march 200 miles north to Songkhurai, close to the Burmese border. The march lasted 18 days and took a terrible toll. Stragglers, many already sick, were beaten to death or simply left in the jungle. Those who survived the march to Songkhurai were ordered to build a bridge across this river.
The really, really difficult work of here is men having to stand out in that current up to their chests, operating the man-powered pile drivers. Dozens and dozens of men pulling on the ropes. 1, 2, 3, drop. 1, 2, 3, drop. Hours, days, weeks of that. Of the 1,600 odd men who marched into this camp, more than 1,200 died.
All that remains of the prisoners' labours are the timbers used to support this shelter. One of the few survivors of the Songkhurai Bridge was Bill Holton.
I had ulcers on my left leg in particular, suffered terribly from malaria, chronic malaria, but I managed it. But the thing really that kept me going, if I'm allowed to say this, was just sheer bloody hatred. It was sheer hatred of the Japanese. It was that kept me going all the time.
The absolute worst period here, they were dying 8 to 10 to 12 a day, week after week after week. It had got so bad that the camp couldn't even look after itself, or couldn't even bury and dispose of its own dead.
Who was in charge of this camp?
Lieutenant Abe, one of the members of the 9th Railway Regiment, Abe got his people to drive sick and debilitated POWs out to work using wire whips.
Wire whips?
Wire whips.
Beatings were all the time. Beatings was regular. In fact, they beat you with anything they had in their hands. And we found, much to our displeasure, that these measuring wires they had, they made very good whips for the Japanese, so they used to lay about with these wires, and that really was painful.
Hiroshi Abe, the brutal chief engineer at Songkhurai, died only recently. In this film, made with Japanese students, he has a different recollection of why so many prisoners died.
In the camp, the POWs were fed mainly rice, which disagreed with them. As they didn't eat much, they became weaker. The weaker they became, the faster cholera spread. I had never witnessed such a horrible scene. It was a very hard and difficult time for me as well. But I had to continue my work.
This seems to be one of the most horrible camps in the entire stretch.
Not only the entire stretch, the entire railway. This was the single worst camp on the entire railway.
A prisoner of war risked his life to take these secret photographs in 1943. They show the condition of Australian prisoners past fit to work at Songkhurai. All of the men were enduring life-threatening diseases without medicines. It's not known whether any of them survived. In 1944, the nightmare on the railway finally became public knowledge. On September the 12th, an American submarine torpedoed what it thought was a Japanese resupply ship. In fact, the ship was carrying Allied prisoners who'd worked on the railway. 3 days later, the US submarine Pampanito surfaced to find survivors clinging to wreckage. Graphic accounts of the prisoners' ordeal on the railway caused a political storm in the West. The survivors also provided valuable information about targets on the railway itself. Now the Azon bombers could get to work.
We kind of liked about 10,000 feet because it gave us time to do some corrections like that. But sometimes the visibility was poor, and we'd have to go down lower.
Frank Nelson's training was paying off. Azon bombs proved to be devastatingly accurate, knocking out 23 bridges in less than 3 months.
On direct hits, probably did pretty well. I'd say that maybe about half of them were something along that line.
But as the bombs rained down on the railway, its worst secret remained concealed in the jungle. As the monsoon rains start to build, Rod leads Bashar to the remains of a small section of railway that's remained undisturbed since 1945. Hidden within it is a terrible secret. From fragments of evidence, Rod has uncovered what really happened here.
Oh, this looks like a cutting in here.
That's exactly what it is, Bashar.
Wow.
Another one of these that no one knows anything about.
So why is there no record of this at all?
Because no POWs worked on this section.
Well, who did it then?
This was Asian labourers.
How many people do you know in total worked on this?
This area here, we had an Asian camp of about 600 men. And women. And children.
Good God.
Because they were indentured labourers. They brought their families with them into this hill. The British had taken them from southern India, had been working them in Malaya as indentured labourers in Malaya. When the British were driven out, the Japanese had this huge labour force.
Yeah.
So they brought them up here to build this railway. But we have a camp of a nominal strength of 600, but reinforced, reinforced and reinforced. Mm-hmm. We know from some records that the total death toll in this camp alone was 5,000. So we have these records of POWs, the deaths of POWs and how terrible that was. But compared to what happened to the Asians.
Well, the story is getting grimmer by the day.
"90,000 Asian men, women and children died, including 40,000 Burmese and 40,000 Tamils from Malaya. 7 out of every 10 deaths on the railway were Asian. And yet this tragedy has been all but erased from history.
What about the bodies?
They're still here, wherever they were left, wherever they were buried, in mass graves. Some places they actually used POWs to do the mass burials of the Asians. And of almost 90,000 Asians, only 3 are buried in graves today. 3. And even those 3 have a plaque that says unknown.
It's like the Holocaust. At some point, a decision was made. We can't supply, we can't have machineries, we can't have medication, we can't have enough food, but we're going to do it. And I'm sure at some point people looked at each other and nodded, knowing that, well, you know what that means. Yes, you know what that means. A lot of people are just not going to be able to survive it.
Bashar's journey began at the bridge on the River Kwai and ended in the dark heart of a nameless jungle. He came looking for the railway as an engineer. He's leaving, having discovered that his engineering quest has become almost meaningless in the face of a human disaster.
Forget about the engineering. Man, I didn't expect this level of emotional content to this. It was difficult. You tend to want to ignore it. It's much easier to focus on the technical stuff. And it's very difficult to deal with it. I mean, the loss of any one life is extraordinary. How the hell do you even contemplate the loss of large number of people?
Before the end of his war, American airman Frank Nelson had one more target to destroy. Bridge 277, the bridge on the River Kwai. Against a well-defended bridge built of steel and concrete, Azon bombs dropped from high altitude would be less effective. So instead, Frank and his crew devised a plan to fly in at treetop level and aim conventional bombs directly at the base of the solid concrete pillars.
February 13th, 1945, mission number 17. Our biggest day, Bridge 277, Kanchanaburi, Thailand. 4 by 1,000 pound bombs, low level, ship number 53. Four direct hits knocked out center pier and 2 spans. Only once to hit the bridge series. They'll hit, and our tail gunner said, "There's concrete and steel everywhere, you know." War is war. You would destroy buildings, you'll destroy anything, you'll kill people, and that's great if they're the enemy. But you hate to be a destroyer.
On August the 14th, 1945, the Japanese surrendered. For the prisoners and laborers who'd survived the Thai-Burma railway, it was a deliverance from hell.
There were guys there, just standing there, tears running down their face. And there were those, the religious ones, on their knees praying to God. They don't know what he had to do with it. He shouldn't have let it happen anyway, should he? And we looked at each other in total disbelief. It's what shall I say? It's like going to heaven, really. As for me, you know, I remember thinking, I've done it. These bastards didn't kill me. Whatever they tried, and they tried, I've won. What's more, I'm free. I'm a man. I can. I'm sorry. I can say no again to anybody. You know, if I don't like it, I can say no.